Hey everyone, welcome to Kentucky Wide, a production of the Fraser History Museum. I'm Mick Sullivan.
And I'm Sarah Jemerson. This fifth episode of Kentucky Wide ventures into the Commonwealth at the time of the American Civil War.
First, you'll hear the story of a dramatic murder during the early years of the conflict when Union General William Bull Nelson of Mason County was murdered in Louisville's famous Galt House Hotel.
Then, you'll hear about the Union military base that was named after Nelson, Jessamine County's Camp Nelson. This segment also includes the original poetry of Frank X. Walker from Danville, Kentucky in Boyle County. Frank has been a Kentucky Poet Laureate, and he has ancestors who enlisted at Camp Nelson after the Union Army founded the U.S. colored troops during the war.
Frank's poems are a big part of our exhibit, The Commonwealth, Divided We Fall, and we invite you to come experience that right here in Louisville.
So let's get started.
A little over a week after the bloodiest day in American history, the Battle of Antietam during the American Civil War, America was scandalized and fascinated by a shocking single act of bloodshed in Kentucky. Over 20,000 bullets had found their mark in Maryland, yet it only took a single shot to make headlines in the bluegrass state. At the center was a man whose nickname, Bull, could have been a reference both to his size and his tendency to bully anyone who crossed him. In late September of 1862, a rumor spread that Jefferson Davis, the Kentucky-born president of the Confederacy, had snuck into Louisville and murdered Major General William Bull Nelson. Nelson was, in fact, murdered. But it was not the president of the Confederacy who pulled the trigger. It was a fellow Union officer who happened to share a name with the Confederate president. When William Bull Nelson truly made himself known to Abraham Lincoln, he was serving at the U.S. Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. He was hard to miss at 6 foot 4 inches, as he carried his 300 pounds with impeccable posture. And on top of his bearded head were locks of dark, curly hair. Beyond his imposing stature, incoming President Lincoln admired Nelson's courage, intellect, and dedication to Kentucky, the state where they were both born. Nelson had left Maysville in Mason County at the age of 13 when his father sent him to a private military school in Vermont. In the years that followed, he had served with honor in the Mexican War, been a part of Matthew C. Perry's second voyage to Japan, sailed more of the world, and earned the rank of lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. Throughout his career, he was known for his commitment to discipline. He was demanding and prone to yelling. In the truest sense, he ran a tight ship. As Southern states seceded following South Carolina into the Confederacy, Lincoln was desperate to keep Kentucky in the Union. And part of that meant keeping the Confederate Army out if they tried to push into the Commonwealth. But Governor Beriah Magoffin, a Southern sympathizer, was unwilling to help. Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister Southern states, he said. It was in May of 1861 that the Kentucky legislature voted not to secede. Magoffin hoped to remain neutral. He sent letters both to Confederate President Jefferson Davis and United States President Abraham Lincoln, requesting that each government honor Kentucky's neutral position. However, during the very same month of May, William Bull Nelson and a team of Unionists, including Lincoln's old friend Joshua Speed, were covertly working on behalf of the new president to make sure that Kentuckians could protect themselves against a rebel invasion. Lincoln had to protect the state, especially Louisville, which was in control not just of the Ohio River, but also the L&N Railroad. And despite Magoffin's plea for neutrality, everyone knew the odds of Confederate troops staying out of the state were low. The commander of the State Guard in Frankfort, after all, was soon to be Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner. And most of his enlisted men leaned towards secession, and they had most of the state's weapons. So Lincoln and Bull Nelson hatched a plan. The president agreed to release 5,000 guns, which would be secretly distributed around Kentucky to bolster Union loyalists and keep the state from falling to the South. In Louisville, Bull Nelson secretly met with Joshua Speed, who agreed to help distribute the weapons around the state. Then, under a shroud of secrecy, Nelson traveled with the weapons by train to Cincinnati. 1,200 guns were put on a steamboat to Jeffersonville, Indiana, where they could be stored out of state, but easily accessible from Louisville, just across the Ohio River. The rest were left in Ohio for safekeeping. Of course, his presence and the mysterious cargo aroused suspicion from the aptly titled Committee on Suspicious Characters. But Nelson put it to rest when he was confronted. Those inquiring were humiliated by the tongue-lashing he hurled their way. Such outbursts came as no surprise to anyone who knew him. Someone once noted that if Nelson could fight as well as he could curse, Kentucky would quickly be free of secessionists. Before the end of May, thousands of guns were in Union hands in counties and cities around the state, from Covington to Lexington to Hopkinsville. And as the summer went on, Nelson led recruitment efforts to fill new military camps around the state with fighters loyal to the Union. In fact, Lincoln would give a large amount of credit to William Bull Nelson when it came to the question of keeping Kentucky out of Confederate hands. Nevertheless, by September, both armies would have a presence in the bluegrass state. Neutrality became armed neutrality. But soon enough, the pretense of neutrality was gone entirely. In the year that followed, Confederates made a push into the state. There was even a short-lived shadow Confederate government centered in Bowling Green, which was eventually exiled across the border to Tennessee. Nelson was detached from the Navy and made a brigadier general in the Union Army. Though his focus was on recruiting initially, he led troops at the Battle of Shiloh, which earned him the rank of Major General. Through his success and missteps, he left a path filled with people he had angered, insulted, belittled, and bullied. He was met with more criticism and a wound after the Battle of Richmond, a Confederate victory on Kentucky soil. It was August 30th, 1862. After showing up late and trying to rally troops following 2 retreats, he told them, "Boys, if they can't hit anything as big as I am, they can't hit anything." And, as you might guess, that was the moment when a bullet tore into his thigh. Union soldiers headed to Louisville with William Bull Nelson, where he recuperated in the comfort of the Galt House Hotel, which was located at 2nd and Main at this time. But his recuperation was not peaceful. Things were growing very tense in Louisville. The Confederate armies pushing into Kentucky seemed to be heading towards the city, crucial to the Union cause. The rebel army had already taken the state's capital and forced the state government to flee. They took up residence temporarily in Louisville. This was alarming to citizens, but subsequent events led to a near panic. Nelson was named military commander of the city, and he quickly ordered that fortifications be built to repel an invasion from any direction. This work was done primarily by enslaved men. Then he ordered a citywide shutdown. Businesses and schools were closed, while women and children were ordered to prepare for evacuation to Indiana. To make this possible, 2 pontoon bridges, supported by empty coal barges, were built across the Ohio River. Most alarming to residents was the declaration that if the city fell, Nelson was prepared to turn Union guns on Louisville's buildings in order to leave it as rubble, useless for the Confederacy. Still, the Union and Louisville citizens hoped to make a stand. Residents were recruited to help defend the city, of course, most of whom had never taken up arms and required the most basic of training. It was around this time that another man arrived in Louisville, an Indiana-born soldier who had been an officer at Fort Sumter when the first shots of the war had been fired. He was Jefferson C. Davis. That initial C, short for Columbus, was an important distinction for him to make. Sharing a name with the former United States Congressman turned President of the Confederacy was an unusual burden. After Fort Sumter was surrendered and the soldiers were dispersed, Davis led Union troops in Missouri until his health forced him to request an official leave. Like many others during the war, he was working himself into sickness, so he was granted time to return to Indiana to recuperate. But soon the news from Kentucky grew more alarming. Davis felt the need to get back in the field, so he traveled to Cincinnati to offer his services to General Horatio Wright. And Wright sent him to Louisville, now under martial law and bracing itself for Confederate invasion. There, Jefferson C. Davis was to serve under William Bull Nelson. The two men would not get along, and in a remarkably short span of time, the new relationship would erupt. When Davis first arrived, he was met with some fanfare. Serving as an officer at Fort Sumter alongside the fort's commander, Louisville native Robert Anderson, was worthy of distinction, and the press and the citizens took note of his presence. William Bull Nelson placed Davis in charge of the city militia, which at this point included undrilled Louisville residents, many of whom lacked rifles. It was a tough job, and one that Davis quickly lost any passion for. There was little to be done with untrained, unarmed citizens. Just a few days into the job, Nelson called him to his headquarters in the Galt House and asked Davis about the state of the militia. Jefferson told him that his men needed guns, but what he didn't say was how many guns. He just said, about 2,500. Nelson was a man who demanded respect to his rank, and this was too casual of an answer for him. In an expletive-heavy tirade, he told Davis abouts weren't good enough. He should know exactly how many men, how many regiments, and how many companies were under his command. To this, Davis replied that he didn't know. So Nelson threw him out, not just out of his office, but out of the city, under threat of arrest. Jefferson C. Davis, angry and upset, traveled again to Cincinnati to talk with General Wright. Wright, in turn, sent him right back to Louisville, but this time to report to General Don Carlos Buell. Buell's troops had just arrived in Louisville, a fact that the city rejoiced, and Buell's headquarters, just like Nelson's, were on the second floor of the Galt House. On the morning of September 29th, Jefferson C. Davis was in a busy hall near the front desk of the Galt House when he saw Bull Nelson leaning against a wall, smoking a cigar. Davis wanted an apology. So he walked up to Bull, who towered over him, and bravely said as much. But his demands were met with another slight. Bull looked at him, cupped his hand to his ear, and said provokingly, "Speak louder. I don't hear very well." After repeating himself again, it became clear that General Nelson had no regrets about how he had treated Davis, and he had no intention of apologizing. The big man told Davis, in his signature, colorful language, to go away. Red and angry, Jefferson C. Davis threw a wadded piece of paper up into Bull's face. Never one to de-escalate a situation, Bull responded with a backhand to the side of Davis's head. As the furious Davis walked away, he warned that it would not be the last time Nelson would see him. On his way out of the room, he could hear Bull Nelson's loud, angry words, spoken to other people, yet surely spoken loud enough to further fuel the fire burning between the two men. 3 minutes later, as William Bull Nelson began up a Galt House staircase, Jefferson C. Davis appeared behind him with a pistol. He pulled the trigger, and his shot found Nelson's heart. Within hours, Bull was dead. The very public murder was a shock to the army, to the city, and to the nation. Once it was clearly understood that the other Jefferson Davis had nothing to do with it, Americans were still shocked to consider a murder between two Union officers. Jefferson C. Davis did not flee. He was arrested and held in a room at the very same building where the murder took place. The Confederate invasion of Louisville never came. Days later, most of the troops left Louisville for the Battle of Perryville. This battle, a Union victory, essentially kept Kentucky in Union control for the remainder of the war. The shocking murder, which had been depicted in illustration on the cover of Harper's Weekly, soon became old news. Things could happen fast during the Civil War, and many other stories pushed it out of the news. Davis was found guilty on manslaughter charges in Louisville, but he posted bail and faced no penalty from the United States Army. With a need for experienced officers in the Civil War, Jefferson C. Davis returned to active duty and served the Army without promotion until the end of his life in 1879. 6 months after the murder, the United States Army opened a new supply depot, base, and hospital near Nicholasville in Jessamine County, Kentucky. Named in honor of William Bull Nelson, Camp Nelson was originally a strategic location as fighting moved towards Tennessee. But before the war's end, the location became a part of history for other reasons.
Palisade Picket Fence Speaks by Frank X. Walker. You'd never believe these grounds, perfectly seated to seize the Cumberland Gap, invade Tennessee and protect the only bridge between here and the state capital, would instead lay siege to Onyx men being chattel, become a bridge to their first real freedoms, provide a new home for recruits and their families. You don't know how wise a choice that was until you gaze across the cliffs from the south side and up at my high rock head and shoulders. It's like God started building the perfect refuge, then left it up for his children to make it so.
Frank X. Walker is Kentucky's first African-American poet laureate. This poem and others you will hear in this segment are part of his latest publication, Load In 9 Times, a work inspired by historic documents uncovered while Walker was researching African-American soldiers in the Civil War. At least one of Walker's own ancestors enlisted in the U.S. colored troops at Camp Nelson, the subject of the poem you've just heard, where more than 10,000 other African-American men found their freedom by fighting for the Union Army. Early in the war, both the Union and Confederate armies had more volunteers signing up than they could effectively train and equip. However, enlistment dwindled as the war went on longer than most anticipated. Casualties piled up. Farms and businesses languished while sons and fathers were on the war front. Both sides tried draft laws to increase the number of troops. But of course, there was a large group of men more than willing to fight: African Americans. But for the first part of the war, this was impossible. A federal law dating back to 1792 prohibited African Americans from fighting in the United States Army. President Lincoln wrestled with the idea of allowing black soldiers to enlist. On one hand, there was a belief that allowing African Americans to fight could cause the border states to secede to the Confederacy. On the other hand, the need for willing troops was growing greater day by day. In 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act in advance of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The Confiscation Act allowed for the seizure of property from Confederate supporters, including enslaved people. Similarly, the Emancipation Proclamation freed those that were enslaved in the Confederacy. While this was not exactly enforceable, it meant that as the Union Army made its way through the South, any enslaved people that escaped from a Confederate state and made it to the Union or to Union troops were considered to be free. That same year, the Militia Act of 1862 removed the word white from the definition of who could serve in the military. The United States Colored Troops was officially formed in 1863 to recruit African American soldiers.
Frederick Douglass Recruits by Frank X. Walker. Are free men less brave than slaves? Colored men, enter the army now. Defend this country and her honor. Enlist and take up arms against our former masters. Fight for your families. Generations of us have suffered under the horrors of slavery. If we wish to be free, we must join in fighting the battles of liberty. Know that it is now or never. Let us die as free men, not live as slaves. Men of color, brothers and fathers, let nothing deter you from joining this cause. Our enemies have made this country believe people of color are cowards. Quit feeding those falsehoods. Rise up. Strike now and enlist for 3 years of service. If we march under the banner of the United States, victory will be won. Come, let us prove we are worthy, exceptional, and yearning to fight zealously for our freedom.
Camp Nelson was originally built to serve as a supply depot, operating base, and hospital. Following its opening in April 1863, Camp Nelson also served as a recruiting post for white soldiers, as well as a sanctuary for white refugees fleeing Confederate-occupied Tennessee. This ebb and flow of people meant, at times, that the population of Camp Nelson was greater than that of nearby Lexington. However, by the end of the same year, it seemed that Camp Nelson had completed its original mission. There was talk of closing the camp until things changed in 1864. Total emancipation had become a clear goal of the war, and as a result, Union support and enlistment by white Kentuckians had dwindled. With the need to supply Kentucky troops to the Union, an official order came that year. Among other things, it said, "All who present themselves for enlistment will be received and enlisted into the service of the United States." Camp Nelson soon became the largest recruitment center for U.S. colored troops in Kentucky and the third largest in the nation. Many of these enlisting men who were looking to gain their freedom by serving in the U.S. Army brought their parents, wives, and children along. This presented a new problem for the Army. Those who had escaped from the Confederacy were offered some protection, but those that came from Kentucky were still considered the property of their owners. Remember, Kentucky never officially joined the Confederacy, so the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the state's enslaved population. Initially, these Kentucky women, children, and elderly parents were expected to leave the camp and return to enslavement. Despite this, many set up refugee camps at Camp Nelson. Several attempts to expel the refugees were made. In November of 1864, more than 400 women and children were forced from the camp, their makeshift shelters destroyed. Then, a winter storm with freezing temperatures hit, and more than 100 of the African American refugees died of illness and exposure. The public outcry was immediate. Outrage and advocacy led to an official policy reversal. Though they were still legally enslaved, refugees were now entitled to protection at the camp. A government-sponsored Home for Colored Refugees was built at Camp Nelson. It included a mess hall, a school, barracks, and family cottages. The surviving refugees, expelled during that disastrous November, were invited back as the first residents of the new home.
Mother May I by Frank X. Walker. Randall X. Edelin, Company G, 125th U.S. Colored Infantry. Took almost 4 years and a whole lot of dead white bodies to figure out they needed Kentucky to win the war. In March of '65, the government said joining the Union Army guaranteed freedom for each new soldier and our families too. Come April, I found my way to Lebanon and signed my mark in ink for my Mary and our John, Susan, William, Sally, Daniel, Scott, and Silas. I'm sure Miss Jane felt like she'd been robbed, losing 9 slaves all at once with the power of my ex. I know she had some unkind words for good old Lincoln and the governor, who only offered her $300 for what them called compensated emancipation. Knew she'd be fit to be tied, so I didn't ask. I enlisted without consent.
The Civil War officially ended in May of 1865, and Camp Nelson was closed in the summer of 1866. Some of the African Americans living at the camp remained, starting a small village named Ariel. Known as Hall today, residents remain whose ancestors had first enlisted at Camp Nelson. The U.S. Colored Troops was disbanded after the Civil War, but many of the soldiers re-enlisted. These troops later became known as Buffalo Soldiers, some of whom became the first rangers in the national parks. Today, 160 years after the end of the Civil War, the records of the U.S. Colored Troops from Camp Nelson provide a vital link for African Americans searching for their ancestors. While records of enslaved people can be difficult to find, slave owners found it important to keep detailed records of the men who went off to fight for the Union Army. They were promised $300 for each man lost, and they wanted to make sure they got paid. One person who was able to find out more information about their ancestors through these war records was poet Frank X. Walker. Walker originally began digging into the records of Black Civil War soldiers while he was working on a project for Reckoning, Inc. It was Walker's job to take information from somewhat bland historic documents and turn it into a short biography of some of the soldiers. While working on this project, Walker asked Reckoning, Inc. to look into his own ancestor, Randall Edelin, for whom he had very little information. Walker received a 99-page file. Randall had mustered into the Army without consent in Lebanon, Kentucky in 1865 and served in Company G of the 125th Colored Infantry. Randall's thick file was full of affidavits from Randall's wife Mary's 10-year struggle to collect his pension. Randall had hurt his back by pulling a box of blacksmith tools out of the Rio Grande River, got sick, and passed away, and Mary was trying to collect his pension. The file on Randall included affidavits to prove that he had been injured in the war, to prove that they were married, that they had kids, that the kids were Randall's, all because no one bothered to keep such records about enslaved people. After 10 years of fighting and providing documents about nearly every aspect of their lives, Mary finally received Randall's pension of $14 a month.
Affidavits by Frank X. Walker. Mary X. Edelin, Civil War widow. They make me scratch out a X in ink with 2 witnesses on affidavits to prove me and Randall was married. I fetched affidavits from every doctor still living that examined my husband's piles and old man's bladder, witnessed his pain, and still doubted his suffering while he rot from the inside. Them even bade me make my mark affidavit with more witnesses to prove my Randall was dead and gone. They made me X the page with witnesses so many times on so many pension papers that though I cannot read or write a lick, I come to recognize my own name when I see it. The fancy M on Mary come to look like a woman keep changing her mind, and the E them like to put on Edelin, a tired old biddy in a bonnet, who done set herself down on a quit. I first think my mark looked like a tired old cross, but after a while I come to see a long, sharp knife, like my Randall's old scabbard from the war.
While looking through the affidavits, Walker realized that Mary's signature looked a little different on each one. Upon closer inspection, he zoomed in to realize that someone else had signed Mary's name, and that she had signed using her mark, an X. Her mark was accompanied by the signature of 2 witnesses, as was the custom when someone was illiterate and unable to sign their own name. Mary was the original X in Frank X. Walker's family. Eventually, Walker began to recognize the names of the 2 witnesses. 2 of Frank and Mary's sons who had learned to read and write.
Penmanship by Frank X. Walker. Mary X. Edelin, Civil War widow. I would have knowed who longhand was who, even if I didn't see 'em scratch out their names on the paper to swear my X is mine. My William B. Proud,
Like his daddy, he addressed his letters as pretty as he dressed hisself. His ink eased off the quill just as smooth as works off his tongue. But my Scott in his letters seemed to take the long way round, make big, slow loops, and care not if they spine stand up straight or not. My wheel glides across them lines like they pretty hardwood floors, while my Scott, more accustomed to dirt, seemed half afraid to touch 'em.
While Randall did not enlist at Camp Nelson, Walker discovered that another ancestor, Henry Clay Walker, had. He also discovered that he had 2 relatives whose families were part of the refugee camps at Camp Nelson. It was by discovering more information about these ancestors and the other soldiers that he was researching that Walker became inspired to write the poems that fill his new collection, Load In 9 Times. In the book, Walker divides his poems into 3 sections, dealing with the African American experience before, during, and after the Civil War. This is the same way that his poems are presented in our exhibition, The Commonwealth, Divided We Fall. As you move through this chronological exhibition, you will encounter Walker's poems displayed with the historic documents that inspired them. His work humanizes these documents, granting a glimpse into what it might have been like to be enslaved, an African American fighting in the Civil War, or a formerly enslaved person experiencing freedom for the first time. This episode of Kentucky Wide was written by Amanda Breedy and Mick Sullivan. Music and production by Mick Sullivan.
In addition to Sarah's voice during the Camp Nelson segment, Frank X. Walker's poems were read by our wonderful intern, Kendall Stidham. The poems are part of a complete collection called Load In 9 Times, a book which is available now from Frank X. Walker.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with the last episode of our first season. Thanks for joining us this far, and we're excited to bring you more. In the meantime, we'd love to see you at the Fraser History Museum on Main Street in Louisville.
I'm Mick Sullivan.
I'm Sarah Jemerson.
And this was Kentucky Wide.